In the early years of World War II, America faced a crisis not of courage, but of logistics. The oceans had become killing grounds. German U-boats, sleek and relentless, prowled the Atlantic like wolves, hunting merchant ships that carried food, oil, ammunition, and hope to the embattled nations of Europe. Each day, the tally of sunken tonnage rose higher. The Allies were not short on men or factories. They were short on ships to carry their lifelines across the sea. Between January and June 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic was a massacre of steel hulls. Merchant vessels burned on the horizon, and supply convoys dwindled faster than the shipyards could replace them. To many in Washington and London, the situation looked hopeless. Traditional shipbuilding methods were slow, expensive, and deeply conservative. Each vessel was a handcrafted masterpiece of riveted steel plates, assembled piece by skilled craftsmen following methods unchanged since the days of the Great War. A single cargo ship might take 230 days or more to build. By the time it reached the water, 10 more had been lost to torpedoes. It was a race the Allies could not win, but into this crisis stepped an unlikely figure. Henry John Kaiser was not a shipbuilder. He was not even an engineer in the conventional sense. He was a businessman, a builder of highways and dams, a man of restless imagination who believed that the impossible was simply the untried. Before the war, his companies had carved roads through mountains, poured concrete for the Hoover Dam, and electrified the western frontier. Yet when the U.S. Maritime Commission called for emergency shipbuilding, Kaiser saw opportunity where others saw futility. He believed that ships could be built not as handcrafted art, but as products of modern industry, assembled like automobiles, not sculpted like monuments. When he proposed this idea in 1940, the reaction was almost universal disbelief. The shipbuilding establishment laughed him out of the room. The old yards along the East Coast, Bethlehem Steel, Newport News, and others, saw him as an overconfident amateur meddling in a tradition he could never understand. A dam builder had no business lecturing naval architects on how to construct ocean-going vessels. Welding, he was told, would never replace riveting. Prefabrication was too crude for marine standards. The sea demanded craftsmanship, not assembly lines. But Henry Kaiser had something that many of his critics lacked: vision unburdened by habit. He had watched the Ford Motor Company apply mass production to the automobile. He had seen industrial miracles rise from dust in the American West. He believed that if America could mass-produce cars, tractors, and airplanes, it could also mass-produce ships. The key was not tradition, it was process. Kaiser's chance came with the Liberty Ship program. These ships were designed to be the workhorses of the war. Simple, rugged cargo carriers capable of hauling 10,000 tons of freight across oceans. Their official designation was EC2, Emergency Cargo, Type 2. They were slow, ungainly, and unglamorous, but they could carry everything from tanks to coffee beans, and they could be built in large numbers. The British had first approached the U.S. government in 1940 with a desperate plea for ships, and the Maritime Commission responded with the Liberty Ship Plan. Build them faster, cheaper, and in staggering quantity. The Commission turned to the traditional yards first, but progress was painfully slow. Each vessel required intricate metalwork, custom components, and countless rivets hammered by hand. Henry Kaiser proposed an alternative. Instead of crafting each ship in sequence, he would divide construction into thousands of pre-assembled sections built simultaneously in separate shops, then welded together like giant puzzle pieces. He would use welding instead of riveting, saving both time and manpower. Most importantly, he would create a supply chain that treated shipbuilding as a continuous industrial flow. His first contracts went to new yards in Richmond, California, built from scratch on the edge of the San Francisco Bay. When construction began, the site was little more than mud flats and scrub grass. Within months, Kaiser's engineers had transformed it into one of the largest industrial complexes on Earth. 4 massive shipyards, complete with fabrication plants, cranes, rail lines, and housing for tens of thousands of workers. By 1943, these yards would employ over 90,000 men and women, running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The workers who came to Richmond were as diverse as America itself. Former farmers, factory hands, and housewives joined the ranks. Many had never seen the ocean before. Over 40,000 women found work as welders, crane operators, and inspectors, making Richmond one of the first large-scale examples of female industrial labor in the U.S. War effort. African Americans, long excluded from skilled trades, entered in large numbers as well, drawn by fair wages and the promise of steady work. Kaiser's yards became laboratories of social change as well as industrial innovation. To support this massive workforce, Kaiser created something unprecedented: an integrated welfare and healthcare system that offered affordable medical coverage to all employees and their families. Out of this wartime experiment would grow a permanent institution, Kaiser Permanent, a name that still defines American healthcare decades later. But in 1941, all of that was still in the future. What mattered most was speed. The U-boats were winning, and every day without ships meant more men and material lost at sea. The first Liberty ships from Kaiser's yards rolled off the ways in a fraction of the usual time. What had once taken 8 months now took less than 2. By early 1942, the Richmond yards were producing a ship every 2 weeks, then every 10 days. The curve of progress was astonishing. Traditional shipbuilders were skeptical. They dismissed Kaiser's early successes as flukes, achieved by cutting corners or ignoring standards, but the ships held up. They crossed the Atlantic, delivered cargo, and came home again. Welding, once derided as weak, proved not only faster but stronger. The all-welded hulls resisted stress better than riveted ones, and though there were early incidents of brittle fractures, these were quickly solved with improved steel and design modification. Henry Kaiser was not content with proving his critics wrong. He wanted to break records, and he did. On November 8, 1942, at Yard No. 2 in Richmond, the SS Robert E. Peary began assembly. Prefabricated sections, each weighing hundreds of tons, had already been prepared. Crews worked around the clock in overlapping shifts, orchestrating one of the most complex feats of coordination in industrial history. Every bolt, pipe, and plate was delivered to the exact location at the exact moment it was needed. For days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes later, the completed ship slid down the ways into San Francisco Bay. Newspapers called it the Miracle of Richmond. Crowds gathered to watch, astonished that a 10,000-ton cargo ship could be built faster than some people could build a house. The event was both symbolic and practical. It demonstrated that America's industrial power had reached a new threshold. The world took notice. German intelligence was stunned. Reports filtered back to Berlin, claiming that the Americans were producing Liberty ships faster than the Kriegsmarine could sink them. Nazi leadership refused to believe it at first. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels dismissed it as impossible American boasting. But the evidence was undeniable. Convoys that should have been dwindling were now increasing in size. Allied supply lines stabilized, then expanded. Every Liberty ship launched meant thousands of tons of food, fuel, and weapons delivered to the front. At its peak, the Liberty program built 2,710 ships, won 490 of them from Kaiser's yards alone. Each was a victory of logistics over destruction, of process over panic. In the span of 4 years, America had reinvented the very idea of shipbuilding. Kaiser's genius lay not just in technology but in psychology. He understood that morale was as important as machinery. He treated his workers with dignity, paid them well, and kept them motivated by setting bold, visible goals. Every launch was a public celebration. Brass bands played, flags flew, and welders signed their initials inside the hulls. Workers who had once doubted their worth now saw their efforts reflected in steel. For many, it was their first sense of shared purpose in a national effort that transcended background, race, or gender. Behind every success, though, lay immense pressure. The work was exhausting, dangerous, and often chaotic. Welders endured blinding arcs of light and choking fumes. Accidents were frequent. Deadlines were absolute. But Kaiser's management systems minimized waste and kept momentum constant. His foremen used spotters who moved through the yards identifying bottlenecks and rerouting materials instantly. an early form of just-in-time production decades before it became corporate doctrine. The Maritime Commission, once skeptical, became his strongest ally. Vice Admiral Emery Land, initially doubtful of Kaiser's methods, visited the Richmond yards in 1942 and left transformed. He later remarked that Kaiser had achieved in 1 year what the shipbuilding establishment had failed to achieve in 2 decades. He made the impossible, Land said, look routine. By 1943, Kaiser's methods had spread across the nation. New yards in Oregon, Washington, and the Gulf Coast adopted his prefabrication techniques. Even the old East Coast builders grudgingly followed suit. The average construction time for a Liberty ship fell from 230 days to 42. The bottleneck of American logistics had been shattered, and with every ship that left the slipway, Henry Kaiser's reputation grew. He was called the miracle man of production. His methods became case studies in innovation, his name synonymous with speed. Yet Kaiser himself never saw what he was doing as extraordinary. When asked how he achieved so much so fast, he answered simply, "Problems are only opportunities in work clothes." For the Allied war effort, those opportunities meant survival. The Liberty ships fed Britain, supplied Russia through Arctic convoys, and carried troops and tanks to Africa and Europe. They were slow, clumsy, and vulnerable, but they arrived. They replaced every loss, often before the wreck of the previous ship had even cooled. By late 1943, the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic had turned decisively. U-boat wolf packs, once the terror of the sea, found themselves overwhelmed by sheer numbers. For every merchantman sunk, 2 more took its place. The hunters became hunted as Allied aircraft, destroyers, and escorts, made possible by the supplies carried in Liberty holds, swept the seas clean. Behind this industrial miracle stood a man who refused to believe in limits. Henry Kaiser's shipyards had become a symbol of what America could accomplish when necessity and imagination collided. In 4 years, they had built nearly 1,500 ships, more than all the shipyards of Germany combined. The story of the Liberty ships was not just one of steel and fire. It was the story of a nation that discovered its own capacity for reinvention. The success of Henry Kaiser's shipyards was not born in comfort or certainty, it was forged in crisis. By mid-1943, the war had expanded into every ocean and continent. America's industrial machine, still finding its rhythm, was now expected to feed not one front but 3: Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. Every rifle, every tank, every aircraft, every meal for a soldier overseas depended on the same fragile network of transport ships crossing submarine-infested waters. The Liberty ships were not glamorous, but they were indispensable. From Washington, the figures told a story of transformation. Before the war, American shipyards had launched fewer than 300 merchant vessels per year. By 1943, under Kaiser's influence, that number had risen to over 1,500. The United States Maritime Commission called it a feat without precedent in the history of industry. Yet for Kaiser, it was still not enough. He believed the pace could be doubled, that America's factories could deliver not just victory, but a new way of thinking about production itself. At Richmond, his yards had become living organisms. Each one pulsed with the rhythm of thousands of coordinated movements, cranes swinging overhead, torches cutting steel, trucks carrying prefabricated sections to assembly lines. The process was choreographed like a ballet of machinery. Every stage was timed, every motion studied. When a delay occurred, engineers analyzed it as a medical emergency, diagnosing, correcting, and adapting. Time was the true enemy and efficiency the weapon. Kaiser surrounded himself with young engineers who shared his impatience for convention. Many were in their 20s, drawn from universities or industries unrelated to shipbuilding. They were told to question everything, to challenge the dogma that had governed shipyards for generations. Why must ships be built on the same site from keel to mast? Why couldn't hulls be assembled in pieces like aircraft fuselages? Why should experience be a requirement when training could be standardized? The answers they found became the foundation of the modern production line for large-scale engineering. While shipwrights on the East Coast still measured progress in weeks, Kaiser measured it in hours. In his offices, walls were covered with charts tracking every stage of construction, from the cutting of steel to final launch. Colored pins marked the progress of each ship, moving steadily across the board toward completion. Managers competed with one another, not for bonuses but for pride. The workforce learned to think of ships as products on an assembly line, not singular works of art. The industrial age had entered the shipyard, but behind the speed and spectacle, another revolution was taking place, the revolution of people. Kaiser understood that production was not just a matter of machinery, but of human will. He believed that if workers felt valued, they would outperform any mechanical system. To that end, he created one of the most progressive labor environments in wartime America. At the Richmond yards, childcare centers were established so that mothers could work without leaving their children unattended. Cafeterias served hot meals around the clock. On-site medical clinics treated injuries immediately, reducing downtime and saving lives. In a time when much of the nation was still segregated, Kaiser opened doors for women and minorities in industrial roles previously denied to them. His shipyards became a microcosm of a changing America, a place where merit, not background, determined opportunity. Among the welders were women who had never before held tools, now mastering a trade under the dim light of welding arcs. Among the riggers were black workers who had traveled from the South, finally earning wages equal to their white counterparts. The slogan, "We can do it," found real meaning here, not as propaganda but as daily practice. Richmond became a symbol of the American home front's power to unite under a common purpose. Henry Kaiser's belief in welfare as an economic force also reshaped the concept of employer responsibility. He introduced prepaid medical care for his workers, financed jointly by small payroll deductions. The system was so successful that it became the prototype for what is now known as Kaiser Permanent. In an age of rationing and scarcity, his shipyards offered something rare: security. Workers felt they were part of something greater than themselves, and productivity soared. Meanwhile, the results at sea were measurable and profound. In 1942, Allied shipping losses had peaked at nearly 8 million tons. By 1944, the tide had reversed. Liberty ships were not only replacing losses, they were multiplying the Allied logistical advantage. Every week, convoys stretched farther across the Atlantic, each ship carrying the equivalent of a small town's worth of supplies. In them were locomotives, trucks, tanks, food, and fuel, all the components of an army on the move. The enemy could see the difference. German U-boat captains reported frustration in their war diaries. The endless stream of new ships was demoralizing. Even successful patrols could no longer change the outcome. One German officer wrote bitterly, "They build them faster than we can find them." Back in the United States, the press turned Henry Kaiser into a national hero. Magazines called him the father of the Liberty ship, the miracle man, and America's one-man industrial army. Yet Kaiser himself downplayed the attention. He credited his teams, his engineers, and the American worker. In interviews, he often returned to the same phrase: "If you think you can't do it, you're right. If you think you can, you're half done." Still, not everything came easily. The rapid pace of production carried risks. Early Liberty ships, rushed through construction, suffered from hull fractures in cold waters. Some cracked clean in two. The phenomenon, known as brittle fracture, was not fully understood at the time. Critics seized upon it as proof that welding was flawed. But Kaiser's teams, in cooperation with the Navy and the Maritime Commission, launched exhaustive metallurgical studies to find the cause. They discovered that low-temperature steel embrittlement, not poor welding, was to blame. The problem was solved through improved materials and design reinforcements. The lessons learned would change shipbuilding forever. Riveting, once the pride of marine craftsmanship, was phased out almost entirely after the war. Welding became the new standard, stronger, lighter, and faster. Prefabrication, too, proved its worth. By constructing entire sections of hulls and superstructures in parallel, Kaiser's yards achieved economies of scale unmatched in the maritime world. The methods pioneered at Richmond and Oregon would influence commercial shipyards from Japan to South Korea for decades to come. The spirit of experimentation extended beyond ships. Kaiser's engineers applied their assembly line insights to other wartime projects, aircraft carriers, escort vessels, even cargo planes. His philosophy of speed and efficiency became a guiding principle for the wartime economy. Where traditionalists saw limits, Kaiser saw puzzles waiting to be solved. His confidence was contagious. When skeptics questioned whether ships built so quickly could survive the rigors of combat, he responded with data. Records showed that Liberty ships completed in record times had survival rates equal to those built slowly. In one notable example, the Robert E. Peary, the four-day wonder, completed multiple transatlantic voyages, proving that speed did not compromise endurance. Kaiser's influence extended far beyond production numbers. He redefined the relationship between government, business, and labor. During a time when other industrialists argued for profit guarantees and tight control, Kaiser embraced partnership. He saw the war not as a business opportunity, but as a national mission. His shipyards operated under cost-plus contracts, meaning profits were modest but assured, and every surplus was reinvested into improved facilities and worker welfare. It was a model of capitalism in service to democracy. To visiting officials, the scale of his operation defied comprehension. Rows of Liberty ships under construction stretched farther than the eye could see. Cranes taller than city buildings swung massive prefabricated sections into place with precision that seemed almost mechanical. In the roar of welding torches and the rhythm of hammering steel, one could sense the heartbeat of America's industrial awakening. Even the British, long masters of shipbuilding, were awed. Reports from the British Admiralty described Kaiser's methods as revolutionary beyond precedent. Observers from the Royal Navy visited Richmond and Oregon to study his techniques, hoping to replicate them at home. But they found that the miracle was not merely technical, it was cultural. Kaiser's genius lay in organization, motivation, and vision, qualities that could not be imported like machinery. The effect rippled through the entire Allied war effort. The rapid replenishment of shipping capacity enabled operations that would have been impossible in 1942. Supplies flowed freely to North Africa for Operation Torch, to Italy for the invasion of Sicily, and to the Pacific Islands where U.S. Marines leapt from atoll to atoll. Liberty ships became the lifeline of global strategy. Their gray hulls were unassuming, their speed modest, but their reliability unmatched. Each ship carried a plaque that read, "Built in the United States of America." For those who saw them in foreign harbors, from Murmansk to Melbourne, they were symbols of an industrial democracy that had learned to outproduce tyranny. In them was the collective strength of hundreds of thousands of ordinary citizens transformed into something extraordinary. Kaiser himself was already thinking beyond the war. He saw in the Liberty ship program the seed of a post-war transformation. He envisioned a peacetime economy powered by the same ingenuity that had defeated fascism. To him, the shipyards were more than factories. They were experiments in what a united nation could achieve. He imagined a future where mass production would serve not destruction, but progress. Homes, cars, and hospitals built with the same efficiency that once built ships. By late 1943, the Richmond yards had become a symbol not only of American industry, but of American identity. Newsreels showed women welders smiling for the cameras, sparks flying in the background. Headlines proclaimed new records. "Another Liberty launched!" Crowds gathered to watch the launches, cheering as hulls thundered into the bay. It was more than patriotism. It was pride in collective ability. For the workers, each launch represented a tangible connection to the war effort. They knew that somewhere across the ocean, soldiers would eat from cans their ships had carried, drive trucks their ships had delivered, fight battles sustained by their labor. For many, it erased the distance between factory and front line. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt praised Kaiser's achievement as proof of what democracy could accomplish when free people worked toward a common goal. He cited the Liberty Program as a model for the entire war economy, declaring that the shipyards had answered the question of whether America could outbuild its enemies. The numbers told the story better than any speech could. By the end of 1943, Liberty ship production had surpassed 1,700. The average construction time across all U.S. yards had fallen to just over 40 days. Richmond alone accounted for nearly 1 out of every 6 ships built. The impossible had become routine, yet behind the statistics was something deeper, a shift in the national mindset. The old belief that some things simply took as long as they took was gone. Henry Kaiser had proved that with creativity, organization, and courage, even the most entrenched processes could be reinvented. He had turned the phrase, "it can't be done," into a challenge rather than a barrier. And in doing so, he helped redefine America itself, not just as a nation of freedom, but as a nation of doers. As the Second World War reached its climax, Henry Kaiser's empire of steel, sparks, and sweat stood as a monument to what industrial democracy could achieve under pressure. From the docks of Richmond to the windswept yards of Portland and Vancouver, the roar of construction echoed like a hymn of victory. In these places, where once only marshland and warehouses had stood, now rose the mightiest shipyards the world had ever seen. By 1944, the Liberty ships were no longer a desperate experiment. They were the arteries of the Allied war machine. The Atlantic, once a graveyard of merchantmen, had become a thoroughfare of steel convoys. Each vessel was a floating warehouse, carrying oil, ammunition, and food to Britain, to North Africa, to Italy, and to the distant Soviet ports of Murmansk and Archangel. Across the Pacific, Liberty ships supplied the island-hopping campaigns that drove the Japanese Empire steadily backward. In every direction, the tide of war was moving with the current of Kaiser's ships. The transformation was staggering. In 1941, American shipyards had produced just over 1 million tons of merchant shipping. By 1944, that figure had multiplied tenfold. The numbers were almost beyond comprehension. More than 2,700 Liberty ships launched, each one a vital link in a global chain. For every ship sunk by German torpedoes, 3 new ones slid down the ways within weeks. It was not glamour or technology that won the logistics war, it was volume. It was the ability to replace what was lost faster than the enemy could destroy it. The war planners in Washington began to realize that the logistical miracle was not just about quantity, but reliability. Liberty ships were built for endurance, not elegance. They were slow, often derided by sailors as ugly ducklings, but they were sturdy. They could take damage, limp to port, and return to service after repairs. Each carried a crew of merchant mariners whose courage matched the engineers who built their ships. Henry Kaiser often said that the true measure of success was not the speed of production, but the faith of those who served aboard. To him, every ship represented the trust of its crew and the determination of the nation that built it. He believed that trust had to be earned, and he earned it with results. As Allied victory came into sight, the role of industry in that triumph became undeniable. Generals and admirals might plan the campaigns, but without the ships, planes, and vehicles built in places like Richmond, there could have been no D-Day, no Pacific offensives, no final push toward Berlin. The historian Arthur Herman would later write that, if Roosevelt and Churchill were the architects of victory, men like Henry Kaiser were the builders. Yet as the guns began to fall silent, Kaiser's thoughts turned not to celebration, but to transition. The war had proved what America could do when united by necessity. He wondered what could be done if that same unity were applied to peace. He feared that the machine of progress would fall silent, its momentum wasted. In meetings with his staff, he spoke of the danger of complacency, the temptation to return to business as usual. For Henry Kaiser, business as usual had always been the enemy. He believed that peace would demand a new kind of construction, a moral reconstruction as well as a physical one. He envisioned a post-war America that would build homes instead of barracks, highways instead of runways, hospitals instead of shipyards. The tools, skills, and organization developed in war could now serve humanity rather than destruction. But first, the war had to end. In the spring of 1945, as Germany collapsed and Japan fought on in desperation, Kaiser's shipyards reached their final crescendo. The Richmond yards alone employed over 90,000 men and women. Night and day, launches continued, each one accompanied by bands, speeches, and cheers. The war effort had become not just a job, but a national ritual. Even as the end grew near, Kaiser refused to slow down. He told his managers, "We will build until the peace is signed." When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the great shipyards went quiet almost overnight. The cranes stood idle, the torches cooled. Workers who had once raced against time now faced uncertainty. For many, it was the first silence they had heard in years. The war was over, but so too was an era. Kaiser, however, saw opportunity where others saw closure. He was already planning the next chapter. He believed the same principles that had produced Liberty ships could produce the foundation of a modern America. In the shipyards, medical clinics, he had witnessed firsthand how preventive care and organized health systems improved morale and productivity. Now, he wanted to expand that model beyond his workers, to offer affordable health care to the general public. In 1945, he formally established Kaiser Permanente as a civilian health organization, built on the same philosophy that had powered his wartime industries: efficiency, fairness, and accessibility. The idea was revolutionary. Healthcare in America had long been fragmented and reactive. Kaiser envisioned it as proactive, a system that emphasized prevention, teamwork, and universal access. Critics dismissed it as impractical, even socialist. But for those who had worked in his shipyards, it was an extension of what they already knew: that collective organization could achieve miracles when guided by purpose. At the same time, Kaiser turned his attention to housing. He foresaw a massive demand as returning servicemen sought homes for their families. The wartime boom had revealed the nation's ability to build at speed. Now he wanted to apply those same principles to the post-war housing crisis. In 1946, he established Kaiser Community Homes and began constructing entire suburban developments using prefabricated materials and assembly line methods derived from shipbuilding. The houses were modest but affordable, and they could be built in days rather than months. To supply this housing revolution, Kaiser moved into steel, cement, and aluminum, materials he had mastered during the war. Each new venture became part of a vast, integrated industrial network. He was no longer just a builder of ships, but of entire systems. The war had taught him that production without purpose was chaos. Purpose without production was fantasy. The secret was to unite them. His approach was visionary but exhausting. Kaiser's energy seemed boundless, his imagination limitless. In speeches, he urged Americans to think of peace as another kind of war, a war against poverty, disease, and inefficiency. He argued that the same determination that built Liberty ships could build a better world. Not everyone agreed. The post-war years were marked by skepticism and political friction. Many in government and business wanted to return to pre-war norms, to dismantle the centralized coordination that had defined the war economy. To them, men like Kaiser represented wartime exceptionalism, not peacetime policy. The great shipyards were sold off or closed, their equipment auctioned. Some became ghostly ruins within months. Yet even as the physical remnants faded, the influence of Kaiser's methods persisted. Prefabrication, modular design, and industrialized construction became standard practice in post-war manufacturing. From automobile plants to housing projects, his innovations lived on. The blueprint of the modern assembly economy, the seamless integration of mass production and logistics, owed more to Kaiser's wartime revolution than to any corporate boardroom. Meanwhile, the Liberty ships themselves continued their service long after the war had ended. Many were sold to private operators, carrying cargo in peacetime commerce. Some were refitted as hospitals, troop transports, or floating warehouses. Others served in new wars, in Korea, in Vietnam, in the Cold War's logistical arteries. Decades later, a handful survived as museum ships, rusted but proud reminders of a time when speed and purpose had redefined possibility. For those who had worked in Kaiser's shipyards, the memories remained vivid. They spoke of 12-hour shifts under blazing floodlights, of friendships forged in exhaustion, of the pride that came with launching another vessel into the bay. Many had never built anything before the war. Few would ever build anything on that scale again, but they carried with them the knowledge that they had helped win a war not with weapons, but with willpower. Historians would later call it the arsenal of democracy, a term coined by President Roosevelt but embodied by men like Kaiser. The arsenal had not been a single factory or city, but a vast network of ordinary citizens turned extraordinary producers. The Liberty ships were its most enduring symbol, plain, practical, and unstoppable. Henry Kaiser's own story became part of that mythology. He was celebrated as a self-made man, a builder who had risen from paving roads to constructing fleets. Yet beneath the public image lay a restless spirit. He was driven less by profit than by purpose. He saw in every obstacle a challenge to creativity, in every failure a lesson. Those who knew him described him as relentless, impatient, and inspiring. He had no tolerance for the word impossible. In the years that followed, Kaiser expanded his industrial empire into new realms: aluminum production, automobile manufacturing, and dam construction. The Hoover Dam, completed before the war, had already established his name as a builder of record-breaking projects. Now, he sought to bring that same ambition to peacetime industries. His company, Kaiser Motors, attempted to enter the post-war car market with innovative designs and mass production techniques. Although ultimately short-lived, it demonstrated his continuing belief that bold ideas could reshape entire industries. But perhaps his greatest legacy lay not in steel or aluminum, but in faith, in the belief that ordinary people, properly led and equipped, could achieve extraordinary results. His shipyards had been a living experiment in that idea. They had proven that barriers of gender, race, and experience could be overcome by training, organization, and shared purpose. They had shown that innovation was not the privilege of the few, but the right of the many. When Kaiser died in 1967, obituaries described him as the builder of modern America. Yet even that phrase failed to capture the scale of his impact. He had not merely built things. He had built systems, mindsets, and movements. The hospitals that bore his name continued to expand, the industrial techniques he pioneered continued to evolve, and the spirit of can-do optimism he embodied continued to define American enterprise. Today, when historians trace the lineage of modern project management, logistics, and large-scale industrial coordination, they often find their origins in the war years, and in Kaiser's shipyards most of all. His insistence that we can do it faster, cheaper, and better became the foundation of lean manufacturing and just-in-time production. His belief in worker welfare as an economic advantage foreshadowed the corporate social responsibility movements of later decades. And yet, for all the technology and theory, the heart of the story remains human. In those years between 1941 and 1945, the United States did something unprecedented. It turned its industrial base into a weapon of survival, powered by ordinary citizens. Henry Kaiser was the catalyst, but the true miracle lay in the millions who believed alongside him. As one historian wrote decades later, the Liberty ships did not merely float upon the ocean, they floated upon the faith of a nation. When one walks today through the preserved remains of the Richmond shipyards, that faith still lingers. The vast concrete slips, the rusting cranes, the skeletal remains of the assembly lines all whisper the same message: that when purpose and production unite, limits dissolve. The ghosts of welders and riveters seem to echo through the empty docks, their torches long extinguished, but their legacy burning on. Each ship they built carried more than cargo, it carried conviction. Conviction that freedom was worth defending, that unity was stronger than fear, that innovation could overcome constraint. The Liberty ships may have been made of steel, but their true material was belief. In the end, Henry Kaiser's story is not merely that of a builder of ships, but of a builder of hope. His yards did not just produce vessels, they produced proof. Proof that democracy, when organized and determined, could rival any dictatorship in efficiency and surpass it in purpose. Proof that progress could be measured not in speed or profit alone, but in the lives uplifted and the future secured. The tides that once carried his ships have long since turned, but their wake remains visible in every modern port, in every system built to serve humanity rather than command it. The Liberty ships rest now in silence, their steel corroded by time, their names fading from paint and memory. But the idea they carried sails on, that with vision, courage, and will, even the impossible can be built.